so the way I was thinking we could organize this is that I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then we're going to just I'm going to ask them to talk about their, to present the text they chose. So in the case of Judith and Todd, since it's their own work, perhaps to tell us a little bit about their books that are coming out, that this is, that we were lucky to read an excerpt of. And in the case of Carolyn, why she thought this text was interesting, provocative, or something like that, and then we could go from there. And so I'm trying to, I hope I got the technology right, but if you want to if you raise your hand, David will put you on screen, and then I will ask your questions. I have some questions prepared too, but this is also a chance for you guys to, you guys in the anonymous internets, to participate and ask your questions to these three scholars. So I will begin just alphabetically with Carolyn Eichner, who is Associate Professor of History and of Women and Gender Studies, which she currently chairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Carolyn spent the 2015-2016 year as a member in the School of Historical Studies at the Institute for Advanced Study, where I had the great fortune to meet her there. And her first book is titled Surmounting the Barricades, Women in the Paris Commune. And she is currently working on two projects, a book called Feminism's Empire, which explores the engagement of French feminists in the colonial context, and that shows how feminism and imperialism influenced each other. And the second book project that she's been working on is on the question of the name, and it's called Legitimacy, Identity, and Gendered Citizenship. And it focuses on the role of personal names as an intimate and a public site of contention between states, individuals, and groups. Next, we have Todd Shepard, who is the Arthur Lovejoy Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University. His award-winning first book is called The Invention of Decolonization, the Algerian War and the Remaking of France from 2006. And it examines how the Algerian War impacted the French state structures and national identity in these very deep ways. So the introduction and the chapter that he gave us today come from his forthcoming book, imminently forthcoming, in fact, from the University of Chicago Press in December. Is that right, Todd? Yeah, December. And of this year, and it's already available in French if you want to read it as such. But in English, the title is Sex, France, and Arab Men, 1962-1979. And as you could tell from the readings, it explores the intersections of the sexual revolution and decolonization in France throughout the 1960s. And he's also working on a new book project called Affirmative Action and the Ends of Empire, Integration in France, 1956-1962. And finally, we have Judith Surkis, who is Associate Professor of History at Rutgers University. She is the author of a book called Sexing the Citizen, Masculinity and Morality in France, 1870 to 1920, published by Cornell in 2006. And she also just finished a book called Scandalous Subjects, Sex, Law, and Sovereignty in French Algeria, 1830 to 1930. And again, we're very lucky to get a preview of it in our readings today. So as you can probably tell from the introduction of the book, this work explores how ideas around sex and gender shaped approaches to law and public order in French Algeria. Last year, she was the co-director of a research project funded by the Mellon Sawyer Seminar called Ethical Subjects, Moralities, Laws, and Histories. And she's beginning to work on a new project that's called, I think you changed the title, but I'm going to say this title. It's the best title ever. Breaking Up.
No, the new one's better.
Breaking Up is Hard to Do, Family Lives and Laws After Decolonization, which traces the development of private international law in the wake of decolonization and European integration. So thank you again so much. We can all clap for all of you to come here. And yeah, so if you could maybe just get us started with a few words about the text that you presented, and then we'll open it up to our public.
So who do you want me to start?
Yeah, why not, since you were on the screen.
Okay. Yes, the new title of this book, I've taken out the scandalous subjects, it's Sex, Law, and Sovereignty.
Oh, that's right. Sorry.
And then the other project is The Intimate Life of International Law After Decolonization. So I feel, well, first of all, very grateful to be in conversation with all of you. In many ways, the book that I've just finished has been in conversation with all of you for, over a series of years. So it's a particular pleasure to now share it in its almost fully complete form. So to take some of the, I just had something come up on my screen, sorry. To take some of the language from Todd's book, I think in many ways the book or the introduction that I've shared with you is a book about the sex talk of French colonial jurists. So in the course, both of the introduction that I've shared and the book as a whole, I detail how and why French jurists and many political and social commentators that followed in their wake were both fascinated by and repulsed by Muslim sex, right? And so there are all sorts of interesting intersections with the other two pieces. So as I detail, they endlessly reiterated a series of cliches about Muslim men's simultaneously religious and sexual attachment to, as I show, polygamy, child marriage, and repudiation. That is to say, a perverted form of patriarchal sex that in their view also, and we see here the connection to Todd's work, gave rise to sodomy, right? And they simultaneously critiqued ideas of Muslim women's legal and physical victimization by that perversely patriarchal law. As we're all too aware, much of this discourse continues to circulate today. So the real aim of the book is to historicize why sex and the family are, and continue to be the terrain on which the Muslim question in France and Europe is so often posed. And so part of what I try to do in the introduction and the book is to look to Algerian colonial law to answer that question. So one thing that I think is a kind of interesting point of contrast with Todd's work, and then maybe a sort of similarity with the Amster piece that Carolyn chose, is that I've clearly taken a sort of longue durée approach to the question in order to examine how the French imperial state shaped the practice and meaning of Muslim law in Algeria for more than a century, right? So I think one of the things that we may want to talk about is the question of kind of, longue durée versus a kind of short durée analysis. So I'm interested in showing over the course of this century how sexual and family matters became central to the process and practice of colonization. So I suggest that the sexualized construction of Muslim law shaped colonial rule in concrete ways. It structured legal definitions of personhood and property, civil and land registration, as well as criminal law and political rights. In doing so, the book offers a genealogy of what I suggest is an often unexamined category of legal category of personal status. And many people who write about the history of colonial law, and here Todd is perhaps more the exception than the rule, kind of assume the self-evidence of this category of personal status, and I actually attempt to demonstrate its embedded legal history as the framework that organized Muslim and customary law jurisdiction in colonial Algeria, and that continues to structure family law codes in many post-colonial states. So as I spell out in the introduction, I track this history over the course of a century in order to explain why kind of family and sex came to be seen as the presumptive domain of intimate concern, right? And how these were cleaved from property law, which was increasingly territorialized. So part of what I'm doing is actually looking at how and the domain of colonial intimacy was constituted by also looking what was separated from or excluded from it. So the book has obvious points of connection with Todd's book and with the Amster article that Carolyn chose, both in its post-Saidian and post-Foucauldian impulses. And it similarly, I think, and this is another clear point of connection, analyzes processes of corporealization. That is to say, how it is that sexed, raced, gendered, as well as economic differentials of power actually take on embodied form. So Over the course of the book, and it's perhaps less overtly evident in the introduction, I take the productive work of Orientalist discourse and imagery seriously, but focus specifically on law as a site in which we actually see how those discourses and images take on a real concrete material as well as affective effects, right? So the idea is that this is where we actually see, the work of kind of sex talk taking hold. So at the same time, I'm interested in exploring how and why this is the case. That is to say, why was sex talk so effective, right? And this is where, and this is one of the, I think, significant methodological interventions of the book, is to kind of investigate these affective dimensions of legal fantasy, so the power of legal fantasy and the affective investment in law. So as I suggest, right, jurists and politicians evidently instrumentalized sex towards kind of material interest and political interest, but I'm interested in trying to understand how and why it was effective as such, and this is where I turn to questions of the relationship between the psychic and the political, which is, I think, another clear point of connection with the other two works. So I think maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you for inviting me, Camille. Thanks everyone for participating. So I selected Amster's piece on the syphilitic era because I think it's a really great and engaging example of how knowledge creation is used for ideological purposes of political power. My work is on how feminism and imperialism inform and shape each other in metropolitan colony in the late 19th century. So it's clearly a different project, but I want to talk a bit about, how I read her, or how I read her, and also how her work informs my own. So Amster's The Syphilitic Arab shows how French doctors in Algeria invented the disease of Arab syphilis and then proceeded to demonstrate how it was pervasive amongst the North African Muslim population, despite the fact that there was absolutely no evidence that it was even a disease with any kind of prevalence in the population. So Amster uses Foucault's idea of biopolitics to demonstrate the way in which the Arab body is constructed as diseased and fundamentally flawed, and thus essentially different from and inferior to the French. And this means that they cannot become citizens, they cannot be French, they cannot become French, that they're unassimilable. So Arab syphilis proved Arab bodily difference. And this was used as part of the justification for the ongoing persistence of separate law codes, as well as justification for creating closed brothels and essentially imprisoning prostitutes in North Africa and Algeria. And so French doctors argued that syphilis was not merely rampant, but that Islam caused syphilis. So Muslims were syphilitic because they were Muslim, and that the religion itself was corrupt, degenerate, and thus caused this disease. So it could be, Arab syphilis could be hereditary, it could be transmitted in infancy, transmitted sexually, but ultimately it was, Islam itself was a danger and deadly to body and mind. And doctors proved this epidemic through a kind of, impressively acrobatic way of finding what they were looking for in terms of misdiagnosis, cultural explanations, by attributing it to Muslim inferiority and fundamental flaws. And this was a very particular kind of syphilis. Arab syphilis was a pre-civilizational syphilis, so it was medieval syphilis. And this allowed the temporal displacement of North African Muslims and denied them coevalness with their contemporary world. And so the French colonial authorities, France used this argument of the presence, the omnipresence of Arab syphilis as a way of justifying French colonial rule, arguing that only French medicine and French governance could save Muslims from themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So my project, my work is on how feminism and imperialism influence each other in late 19th century France. And I look at the first few French feminists to go into empire in the latter half of the century, either by choice or by being sent to a prison colony. And so I follow them to Algeria and New Caledonia and the American West, and then also into the Ottoman and Russian empires. The feminists in France, they come from they're in a place of alterity, both in terms of politically, but also bodily. And once they're out into a colonial context, the hierarchy shifts a little bit because of their race and their nationality. So in the imperial context, French feminists appropriated imperial concepts. And part of what their project was to reconceptualize Frenchness, and they did so through looking at things like marriage, women's legal status, women's social status, and polygamy. So I'm really interested in the question of whether or not there could be a clear kind of dichotomy between a clear anti-imperialism in this period and a clear pro-imperialism. And so I look at the feminist newspaper La Citoyenne, which advocated a feminist imperialist, so it was pro-imperialist. This newspaper was edited by Hubertine Auclair. And then I also look at a self-defined anti-imperialist, and that's Louise Michel, and that's in the Algerian and New Caledonian context, and I problematize this assertion of anti-imperialism. So the book also looks at the gendered and sexualized penal colony, the feminist ethnographic project, and then feminist engagement with the figure of the exoticized and eroticized Jew. Mm-hmm. So both my project and Amster's, the subjects are constructed as sexually perverse, as deficient, as degenerate by the French state and its agents. Mm-hmm. And both French feminists and Algerian Muslims, they have unattainable paths to full integration because of bodily reasons, because of the construction of their bodies. And so both Amster and I look primarily at kind of from a top-down perspective, from the French perspective. So she's looking at the way that French doctors and the French colonial authority are constructing and affecting the Arab. And I'm looking at French feminists and their ideas, but they're also the objects of context, and that sort of that hierarchy shifts somewhat. So just to tie things up, I also look at Louise Michel in New Caledonia and Algeria, her ethnographic project, which was transcribing, and publishing the oral tales of the indigenous Kanak people, and the way in which she kind of dissected up these texts to represent them to her French and international audience, as well as looking at Hubertine Auclair, Olympe Audouard, who traveled into the American West and wrote about Mormon polygamy and compared it positively to women's status under the Napoleonic Code. And then also how the Hubertine Auclair, the editor of the feminist newspaper La Citoyenne, talked about the Tuareg, the North African Tuareg people, who called themselves the children of the mother, as a way to compare questions of legitimacy and legal paternity, comparing it with, with the Napoleonic Code. So I very much enjoyed this process and very much enjoyed getting a chance to read Todd and Judith's work, and look forward to the rest of it.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. So Todd, you want to finish us off with some thoughts about your project?
Yes. Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks, first of all, to Camille and to David Smith, Camille Robcis and David Smith, for organizing and inviting us to organizing the webinar and inviting us to participate. And thanks to everybody. I'm really looking forward to hearing from other people who haven't yet had a chance to speak or to write in this forum. But obviously, this is part of a book that'll be out in a couple of months in December. It is Sex, France, and Arab Men. As Judith pointed out, it's based on what I call sex talk. And so one of the basic framing devices is that there's all of this explosion of types of evidence that appears much more publicly and very widely. There, of course, has always been references to sex, about sex, talk about sex, but this is the context of the sexual revolution propulsed by by massive consumerism and its expansion, new forms of consumer capitalism. And so what I wanted to do in part is to have us pay attention to sex talk, to do something additionally to explore questions of sexuality. And obviously, Foucault's work and other discussions such that you tended to use discussions of sex to talk about, in particular, sexuality or sex itself. So this is in part an insistence that there's so much more that we can do with this type of evidence. It becomes particularly important in certain moments. It's certainly not particular to the sexual revolution. I mean, think back, of course, to Robert Darnton's amazing work and all the stuff that's been done around that in the old regime. But pornography and other discussions, whether it's about Marie Antoinette, Lynn Hunt, etc., so much interesting material. So here, again, trying to focus our attention on that as a category of evidence then. And in a period that I call post-decolonization. This is the chapter that I gave you, chapter 7, is one of the kind of, I think, 2 moments in the book when the term post-colonial emerges. Now, in part because I want to hold on to the idea of the post-colonial embraced by post-colonial theorists as something that both speaks to the larger history of the centrality of colonialism to understanding the modern world most generally, but also captures some of that post-independence deception that emerged and crystallized in the 70s and the 80s that allowed people to rethink how can we hold on to the critical importance and acuity of anti-colonial arguments while grappling with, as Marx did after 1848, grappling with the failures or the disappointments, the horizons that did not arrive. If we think of David Scott's discussions and something like the conscripts of modernity. So I talk about post-decolonization as a marker, something that separates off then this moment after particularly Algerian independence, but decolonization more largely in North Africa, of France's former North African colonies, and other places, notably, of course, Vietnam and sub-Saharan Africa. So post-decolonization then is something that's worth paying attention to as a chronological period, but that also, of course, is situated in much longer histories. Now, for me, this is a very long history. My first book really focused on, 1 or 2 years. So I resent this. But this courte durée is not a moyenne durée of 100 years. But this 20-year period, more or less, or kind of 19-year period that I'm looking at, 17-year period that I'm looking at, I am trying to say there's something specific to it. And notably, it's around this reworking of it's the context of the sexual revolution. B, of course, it is after Algerian independence. So it's trying to grapple with the fact that if we look at sex talk, we see, despite what people like Nora Ostora and others have claimed, there was an enormous amount of French efforts both to name the war as a war, the Algerian War, to talk about violence, to talk about massive racism that was often violent, that was suffered by, we could call them non-white subjects, but certainly colonized and ex-colonized peoples. But to look at some of the specificities of, as well, this frame of sexual Orientalism, a much longer history. I'm only kind of homing in on one section of it. So I'm interested then and engaged with some of the particularities, notably that it's anchored in France itself, the so-called metropole. So how do we think about Orientalism after the end of empire, when we know, of course, that one of the things that's so interesting about Orientalism, this forms of knowledge making that Carolyn's choice of essay helps us think about particularly, is that it kept empire, it made empire seem necessary. So how did people rethink this or renegotiate it after the end of direct colonial rule? And then some of the particular effects that unlike sexual Orientalism, which has been so well explored by so many people, scholars in particular, but others too, this is a moment when it seems that rather than women being the focus, which of course is absolutely central to how sexual Orientalism usually works, that it's men. And within the category of so-called men, it is the masculine, the hyper-masculine, the too masculine. So I want to trace out, as with all forms of Orientalism, both these either Islamophilia or Arabophilia, which is always part of this discussion, usually less important, as well as the Islamophobia, the hatred of Arabs, the Orientalism with all its racism. It's of course central as well. So again, that dynamic, that binary, like philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism, and these things always go together. It's always about abnormality, extremes. But again, in this period, one of the things that was so striking to me is that the extremes, positive is either positive in terms of the Arab Revolution, the heroic Algerian man that I try to map out in both the introduction and somewhat in the conclusion, in the chapter that you saw. And of course, the insistence on the Arab invasion. The Arab man is rapist, as violent, as venal, as carrying venereal disease. That these things were in play across this period, but it was so located so heavily on hypervirility. So the disappearance, then, of course, of the ephebe, the effeminate, the Arab boy, which is another classic element that's so central to how the category of man gets, or male at the very least, gets discussed in sexual Orientalist and other Orientalist analyses. So again, I think that hopefully the introduction itself is somewhat clear. I chose this chapter in part because it's the kind of last, the first half of the book really deals on the one hand with the far right, then with gay liberation movements and the kind of newly visible gay world of the 70s, where there's really quite explicit claims in both discussions, far right, sexual liberationist, gay liberationist, and the gay world, about the Arab man as programmatic, either as something that needed to be vilified or celebrated. And then the last half of the book, discussions of prostitution, then this chapter on sodomy, and then about rape. Rape as metaphor, important for many people to think about how to describe racism. So like so often, rape transformed into a metaphor that primarily is about male suffering. But then, of course, a final chapter on feminist success and also efforts to make rape as act, as a form of violence suffered overwhelmingly by women and female bodies at the hands of men and male bodies, as something that was emerged, had great purchase, and also helps us think about some of the ways that this discussion of the Arab man circulated. So these last chapters then are both trying to trace out larger discussions that seeped into all sorts of different areas and levels of society, in France in particular, French Francophone discussions, but also tries to bring the question of violence to the fore. This is something that my first book, and I was worried too that this second book really sidelines. The first book for explicit reasons, I think, that I found necessary. But here is an area that I did want to kind of think with the importance of violence and sodomy, most notably because I also wanted to grapple with a question of sexual acts. Not, again, I talked about thinking about sex rather than just sexuality, but sexual acts too have a history. I think it's one of the areas where the history of sexuality has a lot of work to do and could be quite interesting in terms of these questions of embodiment that Judith so insistently and insightfully brought to the table, and that Carolyn's choice of Amster's work also allows us to think about. So I guess I'll end there with the obvious point that I think is really self-evident, that sodomy, in thinking about sodomy per se, we're also displacing discussion of the sodomite in a moment then where Foucault's discussion is perhaps one of the most important. I try to show that it's part of a much larger discussion happening in the 70s about how we can think power in terms of sodomy, and in doing so, think about it in terms of new ways, more complex, complicated, perhaps capillary ways of thinking about power. So.
Great. Thank you so much, Todd. So, David, do you want, should I go on, or do you want to open it up, or? Let me see.
You should just go ahead and go on.
Okay, until someone raises their hand, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So if you guys out there want to raise your hand and ask questions, please do so, and I will try to see you. Oh, here's his hand. Okay, Okay, let me see how to do this. Do you do this, David, or do I?
I do.
Hi.
Hi,
Okay.
Eric.
Thank you. Sorry. I just had a question, and it's a bit of a broad one for everybody. So feel free to either address it or not address it as you see fit. But the question, which I was typing, excuse me one moment. The question is basically about how you view the role of appropriation in all of your pieces here, or the pieces that you introduced. Because it seems to me as if this was a concept that was sort of at work for all of you. Judith, you talk about sort of the appropriation of Muslim or Arab law towards French property gains. And Todd, you speak about the symbol of the Arab man to justify the revolutionary Islamic discourse, and that this is being, it seems to me, appropriated in different ways. And Carolyn, you spoke directly about feminism experimenting with new models of gender roles in the empire. So my basic questions were like, how do you consider appropriation as a term? Do you associate it with your work or not? And especially, what are the sort of difficulties, considering most work that deals with appropriation either talks about property physically or cultural property or intellectual property? And then secondarily, like, do you consider that transformation is like an essential process in this appropriation or not? Or is it just something that you can take whole cloth into something? So after that, I will stop talking. Thank you very much for all of
Can you
this.
identify yourself a little bit for us? Where are you?
Sorry, yeah. My name's Eric Meadows. I'm a sixth-year PhD candidate at New York University. I'm in the Institute of French Studies and History department.
Nice to meet you, Eric.
Nice to meet you all.
Does anyone have any thoughts on this? Todd.
Sure. Well, briefly, appropriation is not a term that I had thought much with, I will say that, for this project, even though I think it really captures some of the things that the material that I'm looking at, is deeply embedded in, and some of the things I'm trying to highlight. I mean, in the the opening moment of the seventh chapter that I gave you is a letter from a series of people all involved in the filmmaking industry in late 70s France, and half of them, and the people that kind of are referenced in the letter itself, which is a long letter, are themselves North African. Almost all of them are Algerian born, although living and working in France. And one of the things I note in the introduction itself is that I did make a real effort to look for, an explicit effort to look for what I call Maghrebi perspectives. At the same time, part of the way that I was thinking about this was informed by the work of people, of course, like Gayatri Spivak and her challenge to the idea that the subaltern can speak, and Joan Scott's work on experience. And that was really anchored for me in important ways by the work I did in Caen at the IMEC, the Institute of the Mémoire de l'Édition Contemporaine, where I found all sorts of referees, reports, and editorial discussions, which made it clear that editors in the 70s were looking for witnesses. They were looking for first-person testimonials. They weren't using the references that Deleuze and Foucault were in their famous exchange that Spivak began her article with. But they too wanted people to hear from those who did not have a voice. And they always coupled it, this is what was particularly striking to me, with the reminder to each other that when these North African, in this case it was North African men, when their voices were there would be a lot of sex. So the people would buy these books. People would buy these testimonials. People wanted to hear from them. And so it's part of the frame, right, is that there is no simple voice that's being spoken. These are being enjoined. Men are being enjoined. North Africans are being enjoined to speak about sex and talk about sexuality. And when they do, then they can have access to larger publics, larger discussions. At the same time, I think that this letter from people like Zemmouri, Ghanem, etc., that appeared in Libé in 77, does some strikingly distinct things. It talks about moments that other people don't. Like it combines, for example, Arab and homosexual and distinguishes it as a category from other Arab men. That I think is interesting. It highlights the importance of acts and the ways that these things weigh both historically and weigh on North African men in particular in the present moment, how difficult it is. So those are some of the ways I was trying to make an insistent effort to bring Maghrebi voices or Maghrebi perspectives, I think is a better term, into the discussion in terms of evidence, to caution how little this really tells us about what people thought. I mean, I did, very personal ads. There's all sorts of stuff that I was looking at. And here too, I mean, the way that they're speaking in a language and speaking with terms that are formatted by a large discussion is key. At the same time, whether it's here or with someone like Leila Sabar in her early writings as a feminist who's not that interested per se in North African questions, how things come out, things are stated that don't appear in other discussions. So yes, I think it's something that it would be useful for me to think about more insistently or in a more focused way, but I'd love to hear your thoughts too.
So I would say, yes, absolutely. Questions of property are indeed absolutely central to my argument, even if it's true that I don't work with appropriation specifically as a kind of theoretical concept or category. I would say that clearly part of what I sketch is the way in which French colonial jurists selectively adopt aspects of what they view to be Muslim law, and as a result, in part, they make claims about its preservation, but in doing so and in preserving, there seemed to be a strange sound, preserving aspects and excluding or cleaving it from others actually performs a fundamental transformation that is absolutely crucial to the appropriation or disappropriation of Algerian land. So indeed, there's an interesting apparent paradox that I'm attempting to highlight, right? How it is that the territorial appropriation, in fact, depends on the selective appropriation of or maintenance or preservation of only some domains of Muslim law, even as, in fact, as I detail in my account of the 1873 Valnier property law, they actually apply Muslim rules of property inheritance to divide up collective landholding, so that in fact there are elements of Muslim law that are mobilized as explicitly part of strategies of disappropriation.
And yes, in the looking at the ways that these feminists appropriated, there was kind of an intellectual and political appropriation. I mean, in the one example that I mentioned about Louise Michel in New Caledonia, where she's sent as a political prisoner after the Paris Commune, she's very engaged with the Kanak population. She's really the only one of the communards who is, and she puts together this collection of their tales and lore as a way to represent them to the French, because for the French, the Kanak are seen, this is the 1870s, as really one of their most barbarically civilized populations, and she's trying to argue against this. So she's got this agenda of trying to represent the Kanak as a less barbaric, more civilized, and she uses their oral legacy, their oral tales, in a way that she feels like she's both helping them and she's also advancing her political cause, which is a kind of radical anarchist feminism, and she's trying to argue for this kind of global unity. But in this process, she cleans up and sanitizes, desexualizes the Kanak story, and so she's very much appropriating that. And then it spoke sort of about feminists in general, but the feminists I look at fall on a political range from classic liberal feminists to radical anarchist feminism. And an example of a liberal feminist is this Olympe Audouard, who was very, very comfortable with the status quo in terms of everything except for gender. And so consistently, she's the one actual travel writer who I write about, and she travels very, very widely, and she's very comfortable in and kind of using, appropriating the idea of the harem as a way of showing how she reinterprets the harem and says, oh, this is a forum for women to have sociability, etc. It's beautiful, it's comfortable, and it's her class position. She's seeing these contexts that are only elite. And so she's able to say then, look, here are ways in which these women's lives are better than French women's lives, particularly in terms of legality, et cetera. And so she very much is willing to appropriate anything at hand to demonstrate that it's really a very kind of positive situation to redefine the argument about French women's status.
Great, thank you very much.
I could jump. Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Eric. This is not exactly related to appropriation, but one of the themes that you sort of all mentioned in your presentation that I thought might also get to some of what you were talking about is one of the ways that appropriation works is also through fantasy. In some ways, it's not appropriation, but it's fantasy. And I wanted to see if maybe Todd, Judith, and Carolyn, you could tell us a little bit about the role of affect and fantasy in the work, especially since, as historians, how you've, in Carolyn's case, either in the piece or in your own work, whatever however you'd like to talk about. There's obviously in the Amster, the role of fantasy is important because it's about how people project, the venereal diseases, etc. In Judith's case, you talk about the effective dimension of the laws, the power of fantasy and the fantasy of legal power, which I thought was very interesting. So again, law is not something that usually leaves a lot of space for fantasy or for affect. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, sort of on the methodological level. And Todd, the fantasy there is very important because it's not, it's only, people are just imagining what could happen, but obviously how do you sort of discuss this from a historical perspective? How do you trace fantasy from a historical perspective, basically? I'd love to, if you have any thoughts on this, I'd love to hear them.
So obviously, it's an absolutely central question to my presentation, right? And I guess you noted there the kind of chiasmatic phrase, right, where I talk about the legal power of fantasy and it's the legal power of fantasy and the fantasy of legal power, right? And I'm interested in both. So that is to say, explaining why it is that all of these colonial jurists actually talk about sex all the time, right? And in their actual kind of court cases and legal treatises and in parliamentary discourses, we have the kind of return to the kind of fascination with these figures of Muslim sex. Right, and I tried to give an account. In the introduction, there's just a few spare examples of this, right? But in the middle of legal decisions, you actually have a mobilization of highly kind of emotive, affective, visceral discourse, right? Especially in the communication I give in the the opening, the second opening vignette, where there's the kind of discussion of the violation of the intimacy of the woman, right? And this is being, you have a kind of the projective identification of the jurist with the condition of the woman. And so part of what I'm interested in interrogating is what work does that kind of, visceral legal language do in essentially providing a kind of, as I analyze that, a kind of moralizing legitimation for the work of French colonial law, right? And that in order to understand its effectiveness, we need to kind of take seriously that affective and affecting power. On the other hand, right, the other dynamic of fantasy that I'm analyzing is what I understand to be actually the kind of fantasy of a kind of French legal uniformity, right, which is part of what I am trying to trace, in the course of my longue durée treatment. Important here is the idea that Algerian colonization comes not long after the adoption of the Civil Code, which is the enactment of the kind of creation of this fantasy of legal homogeneity, which is then immediately disrupted by the project of Algerian colonization. And so I'm interested in analyzing how, in a sense, the problem of Muslim law operates as a constant kind of, spur and, troublemaker in that fantasy that actually continues to produce and reproduce an investment in an idea of totality that always also reproduces sexualized conceptions of Muslim difference. Right, so those are the two aspects, and that there's almost there's a part of what we see is an affective investment in that idealized conception of legal homogeneity and the way in which it takes on sexed and gendered dimensions that I think help to understand the ways in which the powerful way in which the kind of anxiety of Muslim difference as that which potentially contaminates, penetrates, disrupts the integrity of the French legal body, right, continues to reproduce itself in successively different moments in different ways.
Great. Does anyone else want to say something about this?
Sure. In terms of Amster's work, clearly this fantasy of the sick Arab, the kind of gendered and sexualized explanation of what's under the veil, the Orientalist image is it plays so much into affect, into emotion. It's I think a real part of the French, colonial authority trying to figure out, how to explain and control this newly in the Third Republic and this newly civilly controlled colony, and how to kind of understand it for themselves, but then how to present it to metropolitan France. What is this idea of it, and how do you rationalize the kind of treatment of the Arab population and its continuing, the argument of the continuing unassimilability of them. And then in my work, Douar talks about enslaved Black women in the American South when she travels to the United States, and she's a significant part of her project is to challenge the women's treatment under the Napoleonic Code. I mean, to challenge the code itself, and so she's using various ways of doing this, and so she is arguing that French women, when they marry, they are enslaved in a way that is basically exactly like enslaved Black women. She's writing this in 1870. She'd been there just after the end of the United States in 1868, so just after the end of slavery. And she's arguing that the condition of French women, married women, is the same as enslaved Black women, except enslaved Black women, at the end of the day, go back to what you call their hut, and then they have a bit of freedom, whereas French woman is forced to live under the same roof as her husband. And then she goes on to argue that another really significant difference is that enslaved women, and going back to antiquity, have the right of bodily integrity, and they can prevent their masters from having sexual access. So she has this, as opposed to French women who clearly can't. Right, and so she's just been in the United States, and I assume she's basing this, both on the misinformation she got from her informants, but also anti-miscegenation law, because Douar, she's the liberal feminist. She believes in the status quo. She believes laws are what they say they are. And if there's anti-miscegenation laws, that must have been the way it is. And so this is, she's creating this fantasy of the French married woman whose condition is worse than the enslaved black woman. And she even goes as far as saying that Black American women are nostalgic for slavery.
Oh my.
Did you have something to say?
So yeah, I had a
Eric,
quick.
sorry, Eric wanted to jump in quickly before Todd. Go ahead, Derek.
I just had a quick addendum question for Judith about. I was really struck by your use of affect with the law, and as I was reading it, I thought this was very sort of new, exciting territory. But then I just didn't know if there were other scholars who were reading the law with affect as a lens, and so I was hoping you could speak to sort of where your work fits in the historiography in that one.
Right. Well, I have to say that I've been somewhat informed by a piece written by Ravit Greichman called "The Affective Life of the Law," that has informed some of my language there. And then I'm clearly also in dialogue with Anne Stoller's work on affect. But I would say that part of what I'm trying to do is really, make a specific and indeed quite concrete intervention when it comes to thinking about law and legal language. And I'm glad and grateful that you think that it sounds interesting and
very exciting.
Thank you. Because clearly part of what I'm trying to do is rethink how actually historicize how we think about where affective investments and intimacy lies, right? And suggesting that part of deconstructing or unsettling our idea of colonial intimacy and its self-evidence, it means thinking about how certain zones are designated as sites of affective investment and others not. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me follow up. One of the great exciting things about this project and other work that Judith has done, is a really explicit mapping out, and not just mapping out, but deployment of tools notably from Lacanian and Freudian theorists here, but other people have worked with affect, and I think it's incredibly, productive and exciting. This is work that has, in terms of the theoretical references, work that has mattered to me, but is clearly not deployed in my book, and certainly not in these chapters, where I've chosen to do more of an exemplarity approach, to kind of map out how a set of things are constantly being repeated and we can see them repetitively appearing, and try to sketch them out into other contexts and analyses, but hopefully making them available to the work of people that are doing more explicitly theorized and more attentive readings that draw our attention to things like fantasy and affect. Now, in terms of fantasy, what I can think of, obviously in the chapter that I gave you, 3 really straightforward fantasies that do really different work. On the first page, you get both the Jean-Marie Le Pen reference to this supposed sodomitical rape that happened that didn't really happen. So hopefully if you read the rest of the chapter and the footnotes, what he's referring to, what he's supposedly referencing with this claim that Arab crowds in France, Maghrebi crowds in France, this is in 2012, so right after the 2011 Printemps Arabe, soi-disant, what they want to do is sodomize the president. They're marching down, they'll march down the Champs-Élysées with this desire in mind. And then we are told subsequently during the presidential campaign of 2012 by his daughter and by his campaign manager and treasurer of the party that he's referring to a specific event, and that event supposedly happened on 16 July 1962, right after independence. It happened on the beach at Sidi Frej, or Sidi Farouche, which of course is where the French invaded in 1830, where the French forces first landed, that overthrew eventually the rule of Hussein Dey. So the fantasy is great, and as I map out, this is endlessly repeated by these far-right sites and politicians and newspapers until I wrote, it appears, I have no evidence for this, but except for I wrote the Inatek, their website, to ask why it is they had a description of this newsreel from July 15th, 1962, that supposedly was the Jean-Marcel Genini coming to talk to Charles de Gaulle about this event. It was a mute newsreel, but that was endlessly cited by various far-right sites, websites, as evidence that this had happened, that this sodomitical rape had happened, of a person whose role, the Consul General of France, didn't exist at the time. So the productivity of that and the repetitiveness in which people grabbed onto it, again, until a very recent presidential campaign by political actors, in the case of Marine Le Pen, who are still at play, and Waterland Saint-Just, for that matter, too, is one intriguing example. The next one, too, of course, this letter, which I think is stunning, and its analysis of the fantasy of la sex photo, that Cornelius Castoriadis also maps out of this, the figure of the knife, of course, a reference in part, one of the reference points here we all have is Albert Camus' L'Étranger, Morceau, etc. Their ability to analyze this, how this fantasy functions, and how it anchors a type of constant attack and assault on North African men in France, of presumptions and accusations and an ambiance that they are participants in this larger story, either as seductive creatures, ultra-virile men who are figures of excitement for some, or of danger. Then the third, to tap into that first possibility of excitement, virile heroes, the phare. Nous nous sommes fait enculer par des Arabes.
Le Front homosexuel d'action révolutionnaire.
Voilà. The Front homosexuel d'action révolutionnaire, and their insistent use of this language of sex between North African men in France, of Arabs, as they call them, nous nous sommes fait enculer par des Arabes, with a sodomitical valence and an insistence this is deeply political. So trying to present what they're suggesting as empirical evidence for a political claim then that is anchoring them onto and with this heroic and particularly revolutionary incarnation or revolutionary essence and revolutionary project that is supposedly carried through by the heirs of the Algerian Revolution, as well as this new revolutionary class of so-called immigrant workers in France. So that's one of the, to speak back a little bit to Eric's earlier point about appropriation, one of the things I am trying to suggest, of course, is how important the Algerian Revolution was in the way that it politicized sex and gender. We know about the veiling and unveiling, but I try to suggest other frames as well. Judith has talked about this too in earlier publications, that this was absolutely crucial for thinking the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution, that is, that sex is political, gender is political. This is something that becomes erased, this anti-colonial genealogy, which is so crucial. And then this presentation of insights and arguments that came from, in this case, primarily Algerians during the revolution itself, or North Africans in France, as political projects that people are taking up and saying, we are right because they think like we do. And in the case of the phare, they sleep with us and they have sex with us in ways that reaffirm our own revolutionary status. So this fantasy of a revolutionary project that is anchored on a fantasy of certain types of sex and what it means, supposedly means to everyone involved. So I think, again, more exemplary than I think the type of tight insight that I think Judith brought to the table with the.
Although I think that, just if I may, there's a way in which some of the, I think there is informing your own analysis, a sense that, that there are kind of psychic dynamics and effects. Although, I would just, there's a, the interesting moment on page 9 of the introduction where you refer to your misuse of Freudian terms. And I actually was kind of curious about why you say misuse, because in certain ways you are mapping, dynamics of kind of repression and displacement. So, but we can have that, let other people ask questions.
We also, actually there's a question from, do you mind if I take a question from David Gessner? Can you?
Gerstner, hi.
Hi, sorry.
How are you? That's okay. It's fine.
Yeah.
I'm a film professor at City University of New York, and I've done research and written a book on Christophe Honoré, and I have a second volume coming out. But I'm beginning research for a third volume on Honoré, which will look at his film Homo Ben and Metamorphosis. So I wrote something out. I was going to try to send it to you, but if I may, I'd just like to read this. Thanks for the discussion. I'm beginning research for a new book on the French filmmaker Christophe Honoré with particular attention to homo urban metamorphosis. My preliminary research, for instance, and among others, turns to Mohammed Amadeus Mack's book Sexagon. Todd, I believe I saw your name acknowledged in there. I don't know if Mack was a student.
Something to do with
I was on the institution committee.
Oh, well, you're in it there. Okay. Let's see. And so Camille, also Camille, it's been very important for the earlier books. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. Thank you. So my question is best directed to Todd as I begin this research. Do you find that it is among the gay liberationists during the 1970s, but of course I have a caveat here with Genet, with his 1950s film Un Chant d'Amour, that the gay liberationist movement, the liberationists, hold a particular relationship with the Arab man insofar as that they turn to the body as a body of desire, precisely because the Arab male body is represented as the criminal, the dirty, and so forth, or in fact, a queer body of sorts. And I use that term advisedly. I don't want to overuse that term because it becomes problematic. So what strikes me as a film scholar is that when I look at the films from the 70s in particular, and I'm thinking of, I wrote something on Philippe Valois' film Johann, which is kind of like this art house gay porn film from the 70s. Do you think that the eroticization of the Arab male body takes place precisely because of his otherness, and in a way that, in fact, heterosexual pornography or erotic, or even I would argue mainstream or art house cinema from France does not do? It seems almost a particular version of queer Orientalism that's in gay film. So again, I'm throwing this out there because I'm beginning to think about these ideas. I thought maybe you might have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm somewhat hesitant about that analysis. One of the things that the book is trying to do is to, by explicitly grappling with the ways that not just gay liberationists, a larger gay public, so both in terms of films, but notably in terms of new newspapers, pornography, plays, public discussions, etc. On the one hand, but also feminists, and they're grappling with this question. Groups that have been targeted as particularly fetishizing, particularly fixated on the Arab male body or perhaps the black male body, but notably the Arab male body, need to be understood more fully in a French context. I think that the idea of fixating on particular subgroups who have, in fact, I think, tried to grapple in explicit ways with something that we could see once we pay attention, has a far more tenacious hold on much larger areas of French discussions, visual as well as other. Okay, so, for example, I mean, in my book, the films that I look at explicitly are things like Diane Curris's Diable au Monde, Bertolucci's Last Tango in Paris, etc. So there's, as well as, of course, La Bataille d'Alger, among others. I mean, all of these use explicit, not necessarily images in the case of Diable au Monde, but images of male Arab bodies, boys in the case of Bertolucci, descriptions to raise fear and to dissipate them in terms of Diane Curris, and of course, Pontecorvo's Bataille d'Alger is fixated on the male body, presented as heroic. So on the one hand, I would want to center this more broadly. I'm dubious that it would be restricted to, and more particularly more pernicious than it is elsewhere. Notably in the types of discussions that I'm pointing out in the Phare, what I think is specific to them is their deeply problematic, but attempt to politicize this story, to insist that this is a specifically historical story of the ways that so-called Arab men exist after colonialism in a context deeply shaped by colonialism as well as ongoing racism. And this is what gives them a sexual valence.
Right. I hope I want to clarify that I'm not calling it a pernicious act on the part of the gay liberationists or the gay filmmakers. In fact, I'm seeing it as a body that is that gay liberationists, these gay men are drawn to, or perhaps even identify with in some way, and turn to as a body of desire, right? I mean, it's Genet, Gide, all of these, people have turned to that body as they're an object of desire, right?
I agree with that completely. All I'm saying is that if you widen the lens a bit, they're not alone. To reduce it to a specifically gay story or a specifically feminist story is to miss how tenacious it is.
Right. And you would argue as well, so that's across texts of the period.
Yes.
Okay. That's what I just was trying to nail down a bit.
That's what I wanted to say.
Anybody else have thoughts on that?
I have thoughts, but I want to get a question in because we have an undergrad who did. So let me just take his question, then we can return perhaps if there's time to this question of queerness, because I also had a question on that. So this is a question for all of you, I guess, from Caleb, who's a senior undergrad at Harvard University studying 19th century Ottoman history. So I'll just read the question. I study Ottoman history, and I'm very interested in the other side of these stories. For example, the Muslim legal background to Professor Surkis's work on French colonial law. My question is, did these French ideas, for example, sodomy, syphilis, and personal status, have any non-French backgrounds? If these authors are, in some sense, performing genealogies of these terms and ideas, it seems important to consider the other potential sources of these ideas and structures. Did you guys, the speakers, look into other cultural histories of these ideas that may have informed them as you identify them among French colonizers? I guess the question is about kind of the other the evidence from that's not imposed from France, but kind of coming from there.
Well, I mean, the sources that that I've had access to, at least in the Algerian case, are the voices that are caught within the framework of Algerian colonial legal discourse. I have read, histories of different legal contexts, whether it be the Ottoman case, the Egyptian case, but the sources that I've explicitly worked with in the Algerian case have all been through the French colonial legal gaze, which is actually the focus of the project, right? Which it really is about the French colonial legal fantasy and the ways in which, there's some sense in the anecdotes that are provided in the introduction, the way in which Algerian subjects negotiated with, attempted to find a way in, through, and against those legal constructions.
Yeah, Carolyn, do you have any thoughts on this maybe? About?
Sure, yeah, mine, I am very much looking at these French feminists' perspectives. And so when I'm, looking into these contexts, in Jerusalem or in Egypt and in Syria, where I'm kind of following their travels, I'm looking at their perspective and how they are comparing it with French law. I suppose that ideally it would be a much larger project, though, to investigate, it's like, how does, like Odilon Baudoin, for example, how does her arguments about, French legal status compare to, to Syria, to Palestine, to the Southern United States, et cetera? Is there veracity in terms of the actual legal history in each of those contexts? But that would be a different project and an enormous project, I think. I think the extent that I recognize the legacy of Turkish law in the Muslim status in Algeria is what I've learned from Judith. So it's really.
Todd, I know you have some thoughts on this probably, right? Because you talked about this in your introduction a little bit about.
Well, briefly, obviously Joseph Boon's The Homoerotics of Orientalism really tries explicitly to map out this type of project, and I'm sure this is one of the things you have in mind. This is, I am, as I said earlier, really interested in the attempt to hear from witnesses, like the insistence on hearing the voices of those who are excluded from discussions, how contextually important that is in the 70s and how that shapes discussions. One of the examples that I touch upon here in the chapter you had is Rachid Boujedra. It's really his first novel, comes out in '69, La Répudiation. The one that I talk about here is Topographie idéale pour une meurtre stéréotypée, and his use of, in this case, of sodomy and rape in these discussions. One of the things that I'm struck by it here is a kind of precursor to the recent Kamel Daoud controversies around Cologne, is how these Francophone discussions that are in many ways aimed at, and this is more explicitly the case for Boujedra, and even someone like Tao Ben-Jaloun in his early stuff, that are explicitly targeting North African discussions among newly free and independent North African publics and newly free and independent North African states. And these get seized upon and used in French discussions by French readers. So that, when Boujedra's novel sells like hotcakes, even though no one's ever heard of him, it's a literary novel. This is in 1969. It kind of sets the stage for this explosion of Francophone literature by North African authors. So I'm interested in these discussions. I'm interested in their claims about their own societies, but I'm more attentive to how these are being absorbed, read in, and also relying on French discussions at the time.
So I just want to add that one, I think, parallel with some of the things that we see in Todd's, or Todd's turn to Maghreb voices in his book, and at the end of mine, my reliance on some of the critiques made by young Algerians. Right, so I've turned to them not necessarily as sources of kind of authentic Algerian voices or more authentic Algerian voices, but as extremely perceptive critics of the French, claims about the liberatory and civilizational capacities of French law. Right, so in a sense, I'm interested in the way in which, especially Algerians who had double training in Muslim law and in French law, were extremely effective critics of this, self-promotional claims of French colonial jurists about the liberatory power of French civil law. So I think that there's a way in which, Todd, you too are interested in the ways in which Maghrebi voices, are, yes, appropriated by the French publishing industry, but then also on occasion are able to point to the blindnesses, repressions, and displacements of, French discourse itself.
Just briefly to point out, the opening vignette, of course, in this chapter is supposed to do that, partly be that, but the middle part. So the phare, their use of these questions of sodomy, they avoid, in I think quite explicit ways, an over-reliance, although they do incite these claims of the Quran and Muslim law and North African culture as really the key anchors to explain why something like sodomy is more widely talked about or perhaps engaged in these cultures, so that they're going to try to explicitly map out a French discussion happening in France and to make it about political and historical context, even as they're also, of course, relying on invoking these Orientalist stereotypes in which the Quran, North Africa, Muslim societies, these societies as more free, less guilt-ridden, but also more pro-sex is a widely thought of wide claim. By North African authors too. I mean, the people that I'm citing, these first person, they all kind of argue and presume for different reasons that their societies are far more open in sexual terms. So they're relying on that claim.
Yeah. Does anyone else? Because otherwise I have a question I wanted to see. Okay, so let me ask my question. In the meantime, we have 10 more minutes to ask your questions. Wait, let me just ask this and then I'll get to. So I just wanted to return to something that you mentioned at the beginning about this question of temporality, and so the three projects are I mean, at least actually the two projects and then the Amster piece. So Todd's framework for this is 1962 to 1979. Judith is 1830 to 1930, and the Amster piece, I don't know, it starts at the end of the 19th century, but then there's a shift in 1948, and she makes the claim that basically you should move from colonial health to global health. So what's interesting, I thought, in rereading these pieces today, is that there's a kind of, it would seem that this longue durée would point to a kind of structural issue in French political, I'd say political, legal, cultural, and even medical culture in some ways, and how the figure of the Arab other figures in all of these different discourses. And that would be kind of on the structural side. At the same time, it seems that there's obviously, Todd is making a very kind of specific historical claim, saying that then it shifts in these new ways after. And as you said, Todd, it does shift, but then it, in some ways it continues, right? It shifts, but it takes new forms. And you mentioned the violence in Cologne. I was thinking even of like all the discussions around homo-nationalism that people like Joseph Massad or Jasmine Barr, or also like even les indigènes de la République, this idea that homosexuality as an identity is primarily a Western construct. So obviously your book speaks to all of these things. So I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about how you're thinking of the chronology in this project, and also how you are and how you're talking up to the history of the present. I think Judith and Todd, these are very much histories of the present. I think Carolyn's work too, and the piece that you suggested can also say some stuff, I think a lot of things about the Arab body, constructions of the Arab body today, but clearly all of these pieces point to why this issue of Arab sexuality has been such a problem for French culture in so long. So if you had any thoughts on this, I'd appreciate it. And then I did get two more questions in the meantime, so I'll take them in this. Or did anyone want to jump in? Oh yeah, Austin, did you want to jump in on this, or did you want to wait? Okay, well let's give Austin a second. I'll figure it out. Yeah, do you guys have any thoughts on this?
Great. So, I think that clearly, part of what's at stake are sort of different strategies of, and I think, distinct but connected strategies of histories of the present, right? Because I think we're interested both in dynamics of, of repetition, right? And so the extent to which fantasies seem to, repeat themselves and return, but also an insistence on moments of contingency, right, in which that which seems to be inevitable in the present we can see as not necessarily so. I think it's definitely true that my project insists on the kind of, persistence despite the contingency. Whereas I think that Todd is interested in capturing the kind of the moment of of opening, right? That has been foreclosed, and it seems to me that I would say that it's not like either one or the other is correct. They're both correct, but it depends on what exactly how you're positioning your intervention, right? Because I think that that we can see I see our two works as supplementing one another, right? There are ways in which the kind of psychic ground of traced over the course of the century helps to understand the moment of opening or all sorts of weird noises, rupture that Todd is able to demonstrate for us in the kind of parenthesis of the 62 to 79 moment, right? So we're both thinking genealogically.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that's definitely like one of the common threads. Did you want to say something, Todd or Carolyn?
Yeah, I could probably let people speak.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get Austin, and then we can return to this if we have any time. Okay, are you on? Can you hear us?
Yeah, I think so. I think I'm
Great.
good. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Austin, welcome.
Hi, Todd. Hi, Judith again. So this has been a really interesting discussion, and I think it's raised a question for me that is becoming very central to my work, which is a question not only of discursive power in colonial context, but the specific discursive power of expertise. And Judith, in your work, this comes up in the context of law. And in the Ellen Amster piece, it comes up in the context of medicine, which has a particular relationship with law, especially in this context. And so I'm thinking through some of the historiography on German exceptionalism, German bureaucracy, as well as some recent work about Portuguese colonialism and the role that bureaucracy played in Portuguese colonialism. And because this is a question I get in my own work all the time is there something specifically French about the way that expertise structured colonial power dynamics in North Africa in particular? Does it just have to do, for example, Judith, with the particular relationship between extant Islamic law and French civil law? And in the case of Alan's piece, does it have to do with the particularities of that the physician in Fez understands Islamic culture to have, or is there something particular about the way that the bureaucracy and the state is articulated in this context that gives expertise a particular discursive power?
Well, I would say, and I'll try not to be too long, but I do think that this is part of what I try to get at in the whole question of the fantasy of homogeneity, which of course really is a fantasy, but there's kind of constant, there's a production and anxiety about the problem of Algerian legal difference that I have to say in the work that I've been doing more recently, and I'm sure that, Todd is familiar with this as well, actually continues after, I know Todd is familiar with it as well, continues after decolonization, where precisely because of the exceptional legal status that Algerians have after 62, right, they're like kind of different foreigners than everyone else. And bureaucrats in the 1980s are constantly trying to get rid of the kind of exceptional legal status of Algerians and make them like foreigner, like all the other foreigners, right? And so that, there's a kind of particular investment in legal homogeneity that I do think is part of French legal history. So I would say on that specific point, yes.
Carolyn, did you have something to add?
Just thinking about the idea of the particularities of the context and the discursive power of expertise is if it's not it's French. I'm thinking about Ellen's piece about the clear kind of enormous discursive power of expertise, and then if I think about it in comparison, for example, to France and New Caledonia, where it's such a different context in terms of the kind of relationship to the indigenous people, the power of the colonial authority, and very kind of a desire to, less of a desire to kind of discursively construct the indigenous population in a way that is anything beyond, just sort of savage, right? So I guess I don't know, if there's the power of the French state, but is how much of a variable is the specific colonial context, and I think that's a pretty significant factor.
Mm-hmm. So we're running out of time. I don't know if there's any last questions before we sort of wrap it up online. Okay. Well, so I think we should thank our three participants. I'm certainly very grateful to have had the chance to reread these pieces, and I just want to remind everyone the correct titles of your books that are coming out. Judith, it's no longer scandalous, but it's Sex, Law, and Sovereignty in French Algeria, 1830 to 1930, which should be out next year. Todd's what's the title now? Sex, France, and Arab Men, 1962-1979, and Carolyn's, which the book is the Feminism's Empire. I don't know if there's something after the colon, but anyway, thank you so much for participating, everyone, and And thanks for all the great questions. And thank you again, you guys, for agreeing to do this.
Yeah,
Thank
thanks.
you. Thank you. Bye.
Well,